Okay, what's in here? Oh, that doesn't look good. Oh my god, a turtle! Let's go! Someone dropped the radio. Oh, Firewatch. What a video game. It is one of the most highly acclaimed games of all time. Releasing in February 2016, it won the BAFTA for Best Debut Game, and one of its lead voice actors, Cissy Jones, won the BAFTA for Best Performer. Now you might be thinking, wait, aren't the BAFTAs for movies and TV? And yes, you'd be absolutely right. The BAFTAs mainly focus on these mediums, but it also includes categories for video games like Firewatch that use gaming as a medium for storytelling. Firewatch's story is one of the most unique, layered, and immersive in all of gaming, and I think it would even make for a great movie. But like a movie, its runtime is quite short when compared to almost every other major video game. Before making this video, I played through the entire story of Firewatch, and my total playtime was 2.5 hours. In a world where players put thousands of hours into their favorite video games, Firewatch stands out as a game that has gone against this ideology, which has left me pondering one question. Why is Firewatch treated like a game you'll only play once? So join me as I try to answer this question and immerse myself in the world of Firewatch. The game opens unlike any game I have ever played before. Many games open with a fast-paced action sequence, maybe even a highly detailed cinematic to explain the world you're about to enter. But Firewatch achieves the same goal, beginning with one simple sentence. You see Julia. This begins a text-based sequence to establish the context behind the story of the game. It begins with a meeting at a bar in 1975 Boulder, Colorado, between a woman named Julia and a very drunk man named Henry, who is the character you play as throughout the entire game. The starting exposition is presented to the player through simple text, but it provides a twist by giving the player the option to shape the background of the characters. For example, Henry's pickup line, if you can call it that, to Julia is chosen by the player. It's important to mention now that every detail in this game matters. The choices the player makes determines the way in which the story plays out, even in very subtle ways. Every detail matters, no matter how small. Henry and Julia hit it off after their blackout meet cute. Over the years of their relationship, they fall in love. They adopt a dog. They talk about marriage, kids, the whole 9 yards. But after 5 years of comfort and love, tensions begin to arise after Julia comes back late one night. The player gets to choose Henry's reaction to this event, but it becomes clear that this isn't your average choose your own adventure type game. The game provides you with 2 choices, and to most people, neither of the options are how you would want to respond. This is where the game tells the player that Henry is his own character, not a reflection of the player, making this experience even more like watching a movie. Following this interaction, they are still as close as ever. Julia makes a lovely drawing of Henry, one that I cannot show on YouTube if you know what I mean. One day, Henry and Julia are out walking their dog when someone jumps out of nowhere to mug them. Henry manages to battle them off, but this event triggers something in Julia that would break their relationship. 2 years later, Julia decides to take a job at Yale, which is 2,000 miles away from Boulder, and Henry refuses to move away with her. So they compromise. While working at Yale, Julia begins to develop issues with her memory, leading to an episode with another teacher. Henry takes her to a doctor where she is diagnosed with early onset dementia at 41 years old. Over time, she is unable to work as her memory regresses. Henry tries his best to take care of her, but he struggles to keep the relationship together. In moments, she is the same Julia he has always known and loved, but on most days, she is a completely different person. Eventually, her condition worsens to a point where Henry can't care for her anymore, so Julia moves back to her home of Melbourne, Australia for her family to look after her, leaving Henry in Colorado, lost and alone. In the summer, Henry comes across a job ad in the paper for a woodlands ranger, which he takes, setting him up in the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. Running parallel to this entire text sequence, we watch Henry hike up this same forest to reach the lookout tower where he'll be stationed for his new job. And once Henry lays his eyes on the lookout tower, the real game begins. As you arrive, You are greeted on a radio by Delilah, another woodland ranger who accompanies you throughout the game.
Two Forks Tower, this is Thoroughfare Tower, come in.
Immediately, Delilah begins teasing Henry.
So what's wrong with you?
Excuse me?
People take this job to get away from something. So what's wrong?
What's wrong with you?
I say you got fired from your job and have finally decided to write your novel. That's the sort of bullshit reason you'll find a man out in the woods.
After an interesting first impression, Henry crashes to sleep, getting some rest before his first day in his new job. Henry wakes up late in the afternoon and Delilah starts to run him through the basics of the job when she is distracted by fireworks being set off just west of the tower. Delilah gives Henry his first task to investigate and shut down those fireworks. So Henry grabs his bag and hikes down. This is the player's first true experience of the world of Firewatch. On walks around the park, the player is given a radio to talk to Delilah, a map of the park and a compass, and various bits of climbing equipment. On the hike down, you can find a supply cache. These caches can be found throughout the map. Whilst all caches are locked, they conveniently all have the lock code 1234. Each cache can have valuable items inside for hiking around the park. Items such as ropes. Unfortunately, not all of them are reliable. Miraculously, Henry walks away unharmed and continues hiking towards the lake where the fireworks were set off. He finds some empty beer cans, a damp campfire, and some ladies' undergarments. Henry then finds the culprits, two drunk teen girls skinny dipping in the lake. With their stereo blasting music, the player can choose how Henry deals with these troublemakers, and I liked my response. If that doesn't show you that I'm petty, then I don't know what will. Henry makes the hike back as the sun sets and a thunderstorm lurks. On his way back, Henry passes through a cave where he discovers a locked gate. Delilah remarks that the key has been lost for years. So Henry climbs out of the cave and is met by the flashlight of a shadowy figure. Henry reports the suspicious guy to Delilah, to which she responds,
Henry, there's something someone should have told you about this area.
What is it?
It's outside.
Come on.
The whole thing. And people come and go as they please. It's madness.
I swear to God, Delilah, if you keep teasing my boy Henry like that, we're gonna have some problems. Anyways, Henry shrugs her teasing off and hikes back to his tower, where he finds his typewriter on the ground. Henry rushes up the stairs to find a window broken and his tower torn to pieces. Both are confused and furious. In Henry's dialogue, you can choose who you think is responsible for the break-in, either the teenagers or the shadowy figure. Delilah puts in a call to forest services and Henry heads to sleep. Now presented with the beginning of a puzzling mystery, the player moves on to day 2. This first day was awesome. It had everything you could ask for in an introduction. The world is colored in this beautiful deep orange. The sound design is so immersive as you can hear the trees rustle in the wind. And even when the stereo is blasting its music, the projection of the sound is exactly how you'd imagine music to play in a wide open space, such as a lake. The mechanics of the game are incredibly simple. The dialogue control is fluent once you get the hang of it, and the player can choose whether to sprint home as fast as they can or to gently stroll through the wilderness and soak in this breathtaking virtual world. The next morning begins with Delilah informing Henry that she couldn't reach forest services due to a communications issue near her lookout tower. So she tasks Henry with hiking up to take a look. On the hike, Delilah takes the opportunity to get to know Henry a little bit more. Henry tells her about himself, many details which the player had selected during the opening text sequence. Henry begins to talk about Julia, when Delilah is distracted by a call and has to step away from the radio. Henry notices he can still hear Delilah on her call. He tries to alert her, but she can't hear him. When she returns, she continues right where she left off. The player can choose to forget about this incident and move on, or choose to call it out, to which Delilah gets defensive and turns off her radio for the remainder of the hike. So naturally, I chose to forget and move on. Eventually, Henry finds the source of the communication problems, a down wire. When he hikes up to investigate, he finds a trail of empty beer cans and one of his bed sheets with a stern message. Henry alerts Delilah, to which Delilah and Henry conclude that the teenagers were responsible for the cut cable and for the break-in last night. So again, Delilah instructs Henry to hike back to the lake to find the teens' campsite and have a word. On the way down, Henry finds some climbing equipment in an abandoned hiking pack. Judging by the name tag, it belonged to Brian Goodwin. Henry brings it up, which surprises Delilah.
Wait, who?
The bag had the name Brian Goodwin sewn into the top.
Huh. Wow.
Henry is curious how she knows him. Delilah tells Henry about Brian Goodwin and his dad Ned. Ned was a ranger too and used to bring his son to the park when he was working. Even though kids were not allowed in the park, Delilah let it slide. She said she always felt sorry for Brian as Ned was suffering from post-war PTSD, which always meant Brian had a hard time. Delilah finishes by saying 3 years ago they both disappeared and she hadn't seen them since. On his way down, Henry also comes across a tall chain link fence with a no trespassing sign. Henry asks Delilah, but surprisingly Delilah has no idea what he's talking about and has never heard of such a fence. So they brush it off and continue towards the campsite. When Henry arrives at the teens' campsite, he finds their tent and sleeping bags ripped to shreds with a note. The teens blamed Henry for the destruction and left the park entirely. Henry is left confused again. Delilah concludes that a bear must have found the tent and torn it to pieces, which they deduced from, as well as the campsite, finding bear claw marks on a nearby tree stump. Henry ultimately agrees and the pair moved on and continued their ranger duties. This is also where you can experience the game's soundtrack in all its glory. Composed by Chris Remo, the mix of classic acoustic guitar and electric piano really reflects the atmosphere of this game, where you would expect a completely relaxing track to complement the serene environment. There is an eeriness to it, giving the player unease about the mystery surrounding the events taking place. Day 3 gives the player the space to freely explore the world of the wilderness without having to follow the plot, which is a great touch by the developers. It gives the player a breather and acts as the halfway point for the story arc of the game. We skip ahead to day 9 where Henry enjoys a sandwich at sunset in the main canyon. Delilah calls him up to alert him that 2 teens were reported missing that morning. The names of those 2 teens match those of the 2 Henry and Delilah had issues with. The player can choose whether to alert the police about what they know or to keep their knowledge secret so they don't have any trouble or potentially lose their jobs. Day 15 sees Henry wake up in the middle of the night, where we hear Julia for the first time over the radio.
Hey, you big dumb idiot.
Where you would expect Henry to be happy to hear her voice, he remains unfazed, even apathetic. The conversation is short and one-sided on Julia's part, as it's clear Henry has no interest in talking with her, so he heads back to sleep once again. Day 33. Now a month in, Henry hikes up towards Delilah's lookout to pick up some supplies from a supply cache. Delilah informs Henry that the conversation we just saw was actually a dream Henry had, and that Delilah was just letting him have his imaginary conversation. At this point, I was cursing the idea that this entire game could just be a dream. It was a definite possibility. We get a bit more backstory on Delilah. It seems like Henry, she also took this job to escape the troubles of a past relationship. She was in a serious relationship with a guy named Javier, who was sexy as hell. And during their relationship, Javier's brother passed away. Javier wanted to go to his funeral, of course, but Delilah got cold feet and retreated to her job in the woods. This ultimately broke the relationship, and Delilah had been in this job ever since. So now both Henry and Delilah have been open with each other. Their friendship has really begun to blossom. And on day 64, whilst watching a controlled fire on a hot summer evening, their friendship too got a little hot.
Without these radios, we could, you know.
What? What could we do?
Well, let me tell you.
All right, enough with the funny business. Let's get back to the game. On day 76, Henry decides to go fishing at the lake. As he walks down, he finds a clipboard laying on a rock. On that clipboard, he finds a written transcript of a call he had with Delilah, the one we had just heard. My boy Henry didn't have his radio VPN on, and so he paid the price. God, that could have been such a great segue for a sponsorship. Oh my God. Henry and Delilah are petrified. Henry hears a rustle in the bushes near him. He walks over to investigate, where he finds a radio on the ground. And as he picks it up, he is whacked on the back of the head and knocked out. From what he could remember, the clipboard with the transcripts was labelled Wapiti Station. Henry asked Delilah about it. She has no clue, but is aware of Wapiti Meadow, just north of the lake. So Henry rushes north to find that same chain link fence he had seen on day 2. Unfortunately, the only gate Henry can find is locked. Delilah suggests hiking down to the firefighters' camp in the southeast, as they might still be there after they worked the controlled fire from day 64. At the camp, Henry could pick up an axe to break the gate's lock, so Henry rushes down. When he arrives, all the firefighters had gone home, but there was still an axe left over, so Henry picks it up and heads back to the tower to get some sleep, as he and Delilah talk on his way home.
Alright, so tell me what you think of this. Did you just cough?
No. Did you just cough?
No.
Oh,
Fuck.
Someone was on their radio line at that very moment. Day 77 begins with Delilah calling Henry, although Delilah is not acting normally.
Henry, we have work left to do. Let's chat about what's bothering you and you'll feel better.
Funnily enough, she's actually now speaking like an NPC. At first, Henry is confused, but soon realizes Delilah was trying to relay a message secretly since the radio was tapped. Henry figures out the code and heads down to Cottonwood Creek to pick up a new radio from a supply cache that Delilah had just delivered. Now that they had a new radio, Delilah returned to her normal self and Henry was on his way to Wapiti Meadow. He and that gate had a bone to pick. Or I guess you could say a lock to break? Doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? As he returns to the gate, night has fallen, and with darkness as his protection, he breaks into Wapiti Station. Inside, he finds high-tech monitoring systems. Both him and Delilah had no idea what the hell was going on. Henry finds a tent with 3 beds, finally confirming that Delilah and Henry were not alone in this forest. Through acquiring a wave receiver in the tent, Henry finds a folder containing detailed typed up profiles of him and Delilah. They were both being studied. In her anger and fear, Delilah suggests burning down the entire station.
We should just burn the place down.
But Henry calmly advises against it and instead decides to just get the hell out of there. As he jumps across the final bridge to exit, the ground falls beneath him. Making it to safer ground, he looks back to see the station now completely engulfed in flames. What the hell was going on? Henry and Delilah are in shock. Henry returns home to safety to decipher what could be happening. He had just found evidence that he was being watched and monitored, but as him and Delilah continued to discuss what happened, the wave receiver began to activate. So naturally, Henry decides to follow the signal. Delilah, who is in complete fear and shock, is now completely blackout drunk, trying to drown out the terror that has been wrought upon them.
No, I am getting drunk.
The receiver leads Henry to a bag hidden behind some bushes, but once he grabs the bag, he sets off a belting alarm, which he takes care of calmly. The bag he found contained the keys to the gate found in the cave he walked through on his first day. Now with this valuable item in his possession, he heads home. Delilah asks Henry what he's doing in his tower, to which Henry replies,
I'm not in my tower.
I am looking at a man standing in your lookout, and it's not you.
It is not me.
Oh my god, go.
Henry runs home as fast as he can and returns to find a Walkman taped to his door. He puts on the headphones and plays the cassette. It's an edited conversation between them that implies that Henry and Delilah are ultimately responsible for the fire at Wapiti Station. Day 78. Henry is enraged. He wants answers, and he wants them now. The fire at Wapiti Station has begun to spread, and firefighters are losing control. Henry decides to investigate the cave, as he has no other option. He climbs down to the cave, opens the gate, and begins to explore. But suddenly, someone closes the gate behind him, leaving Henry trapped. As he looked for an escape, Henry spotted a single Nike shoe sitting atop a ledge below him. He continues to search until finally he finds a way out on the other side of the canyon. As he exits the cave, he stumbles upon a carved out fort, something a child would build. He reports it to Delilah, and sure enough, the fort was made by Brian Goodwin, the child whose backpack Henry found on day 2. He had toys and board games in that fort. He even kept his science homework. He had caving supplies, which Henry took and dived right back into the cave to properly explore. Henry lowered himself deeper into the cave. He crawled through holes and jumped many ledges until he reached the bottom of the cave, where he spotted something that stopped him in his tracks. As he edged closer, he finally realized what it was. It was a skeleton. It was the decayed remains of Brian Goodwin. Judging by the climbing equipment next to his body, Henry concluded that he had died climbing down. A peg came loose and he tumbled all the way down the cave to his untimely death. When Henry reaches the surface, he tells Delilah what happened. In every interaction we've had with Delilah, she's always been out there, the first person to say something. Always confident, even in the face of confusion and fear. But when Henry tells her about Brian, she retreats into herself. Henry tries to comfort her, but Delilah knows the truth. If she had just done her job and enforce the rules around kids in the park, Brian would still be alive. Day 79 arrives and both Henry and Delilah are being evacuated from the park. The fire that started at Wapiti Station had now engulfed the entire woodlands. Delilah also informs Henry that the 2 teens that went missing from the park were found drunk in a random field in Wyoming, meaning that both Henry and Delilah were not in any trouble. As Henry finished packing his things, the wave receiver beeps once again. On Henry's way out, he follows the signal to another Walkman, taped next to an arrow pointing up, labelled Henry. He pops in the cassette and a new voice appears.
Yeah, hi Henry.
Ned Goodwin, Brian's father. Ned was the shadowy figure Henry came across on day 1. He explains to Henry his side to what happened. He was climbing with Brian in the cave, and Brian had not put his peg into the rock properly, causing the rope to give way and inevitably kill him. This event sent Ned off the rails and caused him to retreat into the forest itself. The arrow led Henry to the bunker Ned had been living in for almost 3 years, but the fire had forced him to leave the bunker behind and head deeper into the Shoshone forest. All that he asked of Henry was that no one should look for him, because if anyone ever found him, he would be held accountable for the death of his only son. So, Henry moves on. He heads towards the evac point at Delilah's lookout. Delilah takes the early ride out of there before Henry shows up, so Henry misses out on meeting her face to face for the first time. Henry reaches the lookout and waits for the last ride. In Delilah's lookout tower, Henry gets on the radio and chats one final time with Delilah. In their final moments together, Delilah asks Henry to choose what she should do next, and she chooses what Henry should do next. The player is given 3 options to choose for Delilah, and it's amazing how many players I've seen are just ready for Henry to abandon Julia for Delilah, but ultimately your choice doesn't matter as she decides on her own. But she does give Henry some advice.
I think you should go to Julia, and then you can figure it out.
As much as it may hurt, Henry needs to be there for her. Henry cannot run away from his problems forever. And so with that, they wish each other luck. Henry climbs aboard the helicopter, and the game is finished. So, the ending is a bit anticlimactic, huh? That has been the common consensus among the general gaming community. Wait, so there wasn't a conspiracy? At all? When investigating evidence in Ned's hidden bunker on the final day, you as the player conclude Ned broke into Henry's tower, and if Delilah alerted park services to it, that would be evidence that he was in the forest. So with his climbing experience, he was able to climb the pole and cut the cable. He then cleverly blamed it on the teenagers by leaving a trail of empty beer cans. But when Henry went looking for answers from those teens, Ned had to make sure that those teens were not able to deny cutting the cable, as they obviously didn't do it. So when Ned arrived at their campsite, the tent had been destroyed. We can conclude that this was done by a bear as originally thought, but Ned just plants Henry's bedsheets to confirm the blame on the teens for all Henry's issues and tie up the situation nicely. After that whole incident, and as shown by the radio he had in the bunker, to listen to their radio calls, he'd just have to tune into their frequency. Everything was fine until day 76, where Ned clumsily left his clipboard on the rock just for Henry to find. So, to escape, he knocked Henry out and fled. He now had to come up with an explanation as to how and why someone would have transcripts of Henry and Delilah's conversations. So he fakes a whole entire operation at Wapiti Station, where Henry and Delilah were being monitored by scientists, testing how humans behave in isolation. Through the typewriter in Ned's bunker, we can see that he was the one who typed up the profiles Henry found in the tent. He then burns Wapiti Station down after Henry leaves, and then scares both Henry and Delilah with blackmail using the edited tape, making it look like the fire was started by them. This plan could have potentially worked out well if the wave receiver hadn't have picked up the signal from the alarm guarding the cave keys. Now that Henry has the keys, he's going to find Brian. So in a last-ditch attempt, he locks Henry inside the cave, hoping he will never get out. Unfortunately, he didn't account for Henry being the main character of the game. So Henry escapes, leading to the discovery of Brian and forcing him to come clean and disappear once again. Seems simple enough, right? Now, from the numerous gameplay reaction videos I watched in preparation for this video, there wasn't a single first-time player that actually understood this ending. To understand the ending, you would have to note every little detail in the game as you play it, and put it all together after closely examining each bit of evidence found in Ned's bunker. The average player is not going to do that. So after the one playthrough, the story is over, and despite enjoying the game and the story, there is no need to play it again. And that's why Firewatch is a game that you'll only play once. Or what if you didn't? What if you played through the entire game again, but with knowledge of the game itself, and more importantly, its story? The game rewards your previous playthrough by experiencing the game and the story in a completely different way. It's very similar to the movie The Usual Suspects. The ending of Kaiser Soze being revealed is one of the greatest twists in cinematic history. But when you watch the movie again with knowledge of who he is, you could spot the breadcrumbs the movie leaves to foreshadow the eventual twist. In that case, the gold watch and cigarette lighter. In the case of Firewatch, with the knowledge that Ned is the one behind everything, you can pick up little details everywhere hinting at his involvement. One close and you'll miss it detail comes when Henry goes to pick up the new radio at Cottonwood Creek. Ned has no idea where Delilah told him to go, so he ends up just following him. And you can tell this because every few steps Henry takes when hiking down to the creek, you can hear rustles in the bushes. When Henry enters Wapiti Station, there is a well-hidden note on the property that alludes to the true origin of the station. It is actually a university research station, but it is currently on break with students returning in a month from when Henry is there. There are also other great little details that are slightly separate from the plot. As Delilah and Henry grow closer, you can see that Henry takes off his wedding ring and leaves it on his desk. You can choose to put it back on or leave it on the desk. In a conversation during the early game, Delilah asks Henry to describe his appearance as she's drawing a picture of what she imagines he looks like. You can choose any description you want from the options, and what you choose will be shown on the portrait, which you find on the final day while sitting in Delilah's tower. When traveling to the firefighter camp, you come across a pond.
There's an old pond out here, not much more than a pile of mud. Do you have it on your map?
Yeah, I know where you are.
Yeah? Where am I?
Pork Pond. There used to be a sign up for it, but, well, folks kept stealing it.
Because it's called Pork Pond?
It's a good goddamn name. That sign would look great in a den, or, you know, anywhere.
You find out why she said that by again looking around her watchtower on the final day, as the sign is nicely placed as decoration in her tower. The last thing I experienced on my second playthrough was the hidden achievements. The game has 10 achievements, 5 of which come from just completing days in the game, but the other 5 are a bit more difficult. Filling the film roll with photos using the disposable camera, receiving a very warm greeting from Mr. Raccoon Carter, getting stung by a bee, listening to the original track, Old Shoshone, composed by Chris Remo. But my favourite one of them all, Love Turts. On day 1 after dealing with the teens, instead of going back to the tower, you can veer off to the north back towards the lake, and sitting on a rock on the edge of the lake is an adorable turtle, which you can choose to adopt. In the following days, Henry can talk to Delilah about the turtle, where she asks the player to name him. You can choose from 3 different names. The player can choose from 3 different names. the same name as your dog, but with Junior on the end, Shelley Duvall, and my personal favourite, Turt Reynolds. Now, after completing all of the achievements and running through the game one more time, I thought I had everything covered. Running through the game with the knowledge of Ned being behind it all was really fun and another enjoyable experience of this game. I was happy with what I found. But just to be sure, I searched online just to see if I missed anything. And what I found was not just something I missed, it completely changed my entire perception of the story of this game. So let me explain to you what the biggest theory behind this story is. The big theory is that Ned is not working alone to keep his presence in the park secret. He is working alongside Delilah. But Robbo, how is that possible? The explanation of the story you just finished 5 minutes ago made so much sense. How can this be? Firstly, thank you. Secondly, I mentioned at the beginning of the text sequence that in this game, every detail matters, no matter how small. On day one, Delilah tells Henry to leave his tower to deal with the teenagers, which if Ned is listening in, this creates the window for Ned to steal supplies from the tower while Henry is out. When Henry comes across the shadowy figure we understand to be Ned, Henry rightly is suspicious. However, Delilah immediately brushes it off as just someone from the public. But as we learned that morning, it takes 2 full days of hiking to reach Henry's tower. It's not like anyone could just walk in normally, right? Okay, maybe that is a stretch. But on day 2, whilst Henry is hiking to check on the wire that we know Ned cut, I mentioned that while Henry and Delilah were talking, Delilah suddenly receives a call and has to step away from their conversation. But Henry ends up listening to her side of the call. Kind of a curious detail to include in the game, right? Especially because it's not referenced anywhere else in the game after that. Well, from listening to the dialogue, you can make an educated guess that the person on the other end is Ned.
Heyo. I don't think so. Why, have you? Okay, good. No, I don't think he has any idea. I'm absolutely sure. Would you? Alright, I'll let you know if anything changes in that regard. Hey, sorry about that. Anyway, Julia, girlfriend? Ex?
And when you choose the option to confront Delilah about who it was, she first claims that it was work.
Who was that?
Who was who?
I don't think he has any idea. What was that? Were you talking about me?
What?
You left your button pressed or something.
Henry, that call was work. I was just talking to...
But then quickly realizes that it can't be work because the lines are down. The whole reason the conversation is even happening. So to quickly deflect, she withdraws and turns off her radio. And this is the only time in the game that Delilah does this.
Actually, it's not really your business. Why are you freaking out?
I'm not freaking out.
Good. I'm gonna go quiet for a little bit. Call me if it's important.
The conversation was Ned asking Delilah if Henry knows about him, to which Delilah replies with no. He doesn't. Because Delilah has this direct communication with Ned, it is assumed that this meant they were chatting through the same radios she uses to talk to Henry. She therefore at least has some knowledge that Ned can listen in on her and Henry's conversations, which she was fine with until Ned left the clipboard with transcripts of their conversations, meaning Henry found out that the radio was tapped. So Delilah attempts to fix the issue by giving Henry a new radio. This action on the surface seems fine, but when you think about it, it just doesn't make sense. Radios are not like phones where each one has its own individual number. Radios communicate through frequency, meaning that any radios communicating on the same frequency can talk to each other. So if the new radio communicates on the same frequency as the old radio, then the new radio doesn't make a difference. Henry can be forgiven for not knowing this, considering it's only his 3rd month on the job, but Delilah has been working with radio communication at the park for 10 years. She would be an expert in the field and would never make a mistake like this unless it was intentional. Another question in this interaction was the location of this new radio. Delilah claims she dropped off the radio herself, but the supply cache she dropped it in was south of Henry, meaning in one morning she would have hiked from the top of the map to the bottom and back before Henry even woke up that morning. That hike would have been tens of miles and not something you could have just done in the morning. You know who lives in the south of the map? Ned. Delilah could have easily just instructed Ned to drop off the radio for Henry, as ultimately, the new radio doesn't matter. Another clue to this theory was Wapiti Station. Despite Delilah knowing every nook and cranny of the entire forest that she has worked in for 10 years, she is unaware of a university research station, a station that is clearly visible from her own lookout. It was important that Delilah played dumb to Wapiti Station, as her and Ned could use the place to create the idea that scientists are behind the transcripts and the monitoring. When Henry finds the gate locked, Delilah instructs Henry to look for an axe on the complete opposite end of the map, which gives Ned the perfect amount of time to set up the entire setting of Wapiti Station. It can't have just been Ned. How can someone so meticulous and organized that they can set up such an elaborate plot also clumsily leave out a clipboard for Henry to find, or give Henry a tool to find where he hides his most valuable items? This duality in behavior suggests that there were two people involved in this cover-up, with the goal of hiding Ned's existence. Through conversations with Delilah about Brian, despite her casual attitude towards him in the beginning, it is clear that Delilah had spent a lot of time with both him and Ned, and they were all quite close. Now, it is unclear whether Delilah was aware of Brian's death. Her reaction when Henry breaks the news does sound genuine, but in the end, she chooses not to file a claim to locate Brian's body after evac on day 79. And the same with Ned. She chooses to let them lie silent, as if she was vocal about them, it would mean significant punishment for her. She also never filed the report on her and Henry's knowledge of the missing teens, as that would also raise suspicion that could lead to Ned's discovery. So, to summarize the theory, Delilah was never really Henry's friend. She used and manipulated him to cover up the mistakes she made that led to the death of an innocent young boy. But that's just a theory. Okay. Yeah, I know, that was a bit of a reach, but I do feel there is weight to that theory. But whether you believe that or not, the final thing I want to discuss is a lot more concrete, and that is the message that this game provides to its audience. Thank you to Ewan Roxborough at Press Start for this article I came across analysing the themes and the message behind Firewatch as a game. The analysis he did on this game's message is what I believe Firewatch is trying to say to me as a player. At the beginning of the game, Henry states to Delilah, "I came out here for a breath of fresh air and some adventure." In that single line, the game encapsulates the core motivation behind why we play video games. It's an escape from the stresses and realities of day-to-day life that weigh us down. It gives players the opportunity to enter a completely new world full of wonder, possibilities, and adventures. Another thing I mentioned at the beginning of the game was that the choices the player makes determines how the game plays out. But regardless of the choices the player makes, the game ends and you have to return to reality. Henry escapes to the woods to relieve himself of the responsibility of caring for his wife. Delilah escapes to her job to avoid confronting a difficult situation with the passing of her partner's brother. And Ned escapes to the forest to avoid the responsibility for letting his only son die. And although all three characters are running away from something, each character responds differently to their problems by the end of the game. Ned's actions remain unchanged after the events of the game. He continues to run from his problems by retreating deeper into the Shoshone. Delilah decides not to run away from her problems, but instead in a new direction that will be better for her, by reconnecting with her sister. And Henry, he decides to return to reality and tackle his problems head on, as he promises to see Julia in her home of Melbourne, Australia with her family. There's also consistent themes of abandonment and alcoholism between the characters, but the most important theme is a meta-commentary on gaming as a medium. The idea of escapism is one that's ultimately positive. Firewatch's message isn't to remind players of the inevitable problems they have to deal with once the game is finished. It is to praise and uplift the power that gaming has. Whatever problems someone may face in their working or personal lives, they can rely on video games to momentarily provide relief and joy away from those stresses. I know I said earlier that many people will only play Firewatch once because of its anticlimactic ending, but the real answer is that many people would prefer to spend hundreds to thousands of hours on a single game because that escapism factor is prolonged in those games. Firewatch's runtime of 2.5 hours is much shorter than many players' appetite for escape. The game is much less popular, meaning that this genre of gaming is much less popular. This game came out almost a decade ago, and here I am still talking about it. Games being produced in this genre are the minority, because there is more of an appetite for time-sucking games by both players and developers. But what makes Firewatch so different from all other triple or quadruple A games is that Firewatch is made by people who really care about the medium of gaming, and people who realize the power gaming has in storytelling. Every playthrough of this game is rewarding and fulfilling, and playing this game once again has made me realize how great video games can be.